Hi, I'm Danny Duchamp. Taxation is theft. Hold on a second. Whew. You know, I might not be the first one to make this point. Yeah. So taxation is theft is a common libertarian talking point, and it was kind of an important one while I was becoming a libertarian. You know, all of the libertarians would come out in force telling me that taxation is theft, and my side, at the time, the anti-libertarian side, would largely try to say, no, it's not. And to me, I felt that we were overstating our argument, right? I was not against taxation. I thought that, it was necessary. There was some greater good that it served that made it, worthwhile. But it was still theft, technically, right? And I told people on my side, kind of tamp down your arguments a bit, boys. It's not like it's not technically theft, right? It's clearly technically theft. It's just kind of like stealing a loaf of bread to feed a starving family. It's justified theft. It's theft where there is some greater good that outweighs the negatives of theft. But no, a lot of people on my side of the argument at the time were not willing to accept that. It had to just not be theft at all. And perhaps it's a difference in the way that I sort of frame property and what property is that made it so obvious to me that taxation is theft even before I was a libertarian. And so basically what I want to do first is just kind of talk about what I think property is. And actually, first I should say, well, that's relevant. So for theft to be a meaningful concept, you must have some concept of property, right? Because theft is when I take something that belongs to you, right? When someone takes something that does not belong to him. If you don't have any concept of property, then there's no concept of theft to go along with it. Right, so my concept of property is that it's just a framework in your head. You have in your head the idea that there are people in the world, which you are probably right about, and you have the idea that in the world there are also things, stuff. There's, knickknacks and things. And these things are assigned to people in this framework in your head, right? So you assign, this phone, for example, is assigned to me in your head, presumably, I hope. It certainly isn't mine. And that's what property is, right? It's the things that you assign to the people in your head. The people are in reality, your representations of them are in your head. Now, this might seem like a little bit of an arbitrary concept of property to some people, at least initially when you hear it, but it really isn't. You might think that, well, Danny, you can't therefore say that taxation is necessarily theft. It just, to you, it seems like theft. But that's not quite right. Because as soon as you just start thinking about property in this simple, logical fashion, right, it's a framework, then you start to have sort of propositions that everyone kind of accepts and which rule out certain types of certain concepts of property. The example that's relevant for this is the proposition that the government owns everything. Just everything. The government is the rightful owner of your house, your car, your phone, your everything. The government owns everything you will ever produce. The government is the rightful owner of everything. Just the government is the rightful owner of your house is probably... I don't think you really think about that like that in your head. I think that you probably think that you're the owner of your house, to some degree at least. And given that most people are not willing to say that the government owns everything, therefore they ought to be willing to say that taxation is theft. How does that follow? Right. That is basically what I'm going to be arguing here today, that if you want to say that taxation is not theft, then you must say that the government owns everything. So, first I want to try to go down the general libertarian route, the general why is taxation theft argument. So let's give it a go, shall we? Taxation is theft because if you do not pay it, the government will send its goons to extort it from you by force. And so because that threat of force is always there, therefore you were only ever giving it up the same way that you would give up your wallet to a mugger under threat of violence. And so just as a mugger is stealing your wallet, the government is stealing the money that you pay in taxes. Now there are a few different ways that people tend to respond to this. The first one is that it's just technically not theft because it's actually extortion or robbery or burglary or mugging or something like that. There's some other word that actually describes it. If that's what you get to at the end of this video, then fine. If you want to say that taxation isn't theft, it's actually extortion or mugging, be my guest, right? That's close enough for me. But I will be using the word theft to just describe in the broad sense, just any kind of involuntary taking of someone else's property. There are other ways that people try to justify saying that taxation is not theft. One is democracy. They say, well, no, it's not stealing because you have simply voted on how much money the government will take, and by casting that vote, you've agreed to the amount that they actually end up taking. This can't possibly be the way that taxation actually works, because if it were, then you could refrain from voting and not have to pay taxes. The fact that you can say, no, I don't agree, I'm not going to vote in your election, but I'm not going to pay taxes either, you can't do that? Well, then taxation is theft, because it's being forced upon you against your will. Maybe you say that you were still given the opportunity to participate in democracy. But to respond to that, we really just need to think about, well, does democracy in any way justify something? Like, does it make anything not theft? If me and my friends go out to a bar with you and we all decide that you're paying, then it doesn't really matter. We might all vote on it and you vote against, or you've refrained from voting. It doesn't matter. The fact that something is popular, that people vote on it, doesn't make it not theft, right? So that's democracy's out. Maybe taxation is not theft because you consented to it in some way, like some kind of implicit social contract. The problem with this is that implicit agreement is overruled by explicit disagreement. So if I implicitly agree to something, so you might have someone who's unconscious and you don't know whether they would consent to something. In that situation, it's justified to act as though they were conscious, right? Like, so for example, should a doctor fix you up if you're hurt when you're unconscious, right? Should he just assume that he can perform a surgery or whatever on you, or would that be assault? And then when he asks you to pay for it, would it be theft? The answer is, well, he has to go based on what he thinks you would have consented to. However, that doesn't really work if you are awake to consent or not, right? If you are actually just there saying, no, don't consent, then it doesn't really work. So yeah, there are a lot of people, a lot of libertarians telling you right now they don't consent to taxation, and so you can't say that they implicitly consented if they explicitly do not. Next, you might say that taxation is payment for services rendered. Maybe when the government taxes you, it's just like a company who provided you with a service and you agreed to take that service in exchange for money, and then when they send their goons after you, it's just them recouping the money you owe them because you used their service. This doesn't work because you have to agree to that service, right? So if you didn't agree to that service, like as a lot of libertarians do not agree to government services, they would much rather not have the government services and not pay the taxes. Then nonetheless, if you don't use any government services, you're still required to pay taxes. So at this point, people will start saying, well, you are using some government services, and they will cite maybe the roads. Okay. It's dubious whether the government owns the roads, in my view. Right? The government, like, you might say it built them, but then it built them with taxes, and it built them with taxes from people before there were roads, and so those people, like, it stole their money to build the roads, so really the roads should be owned by them or their descendants. It doesn't seem like the government in any real sense should own the roads. But even putting that to one side, even if you don't use the government's roads, they will still charge you taxes. If you go out into the middle of nowhere and try to start a new society somewhere in like the middle of the wilderness, the country that claims ownership, despite having never been to that location, claims ownership over that territory, they're still going to charge you taxes. Ultimately, if something does not determine whether or not you pay taxes, then it cannot be the justification for taxes not being theft, right? So the fact that whether or not I actually go to a restaurant and get a meal determines whether I have to pay for that meal. The fact that that determination exists is the reason that we say that the restaurant expecting me to pay after having the meal, that's not theft, right? Because I went to the restaurant and I got the meal, and if I hadn't, I wouldn't have to pay for it. But with the government, it doesn't matter what services you use, the government will still require you to pay for it. Now, the final way that people get around this is just to say that, yeah, like the government not only owns the roads, the government is just charging you to live in society. The government, therefore, would have to own just everything. Like, let's start with your house. If you stay in your house and don't go out, the government will still charge you taxes, right? So the government must own your house. If it's allowed to charge you for the use of your house, then the government must be the owner of your house. Now, you might say, well, maybe the government's part owner of my house. Weird. That doesn't sound right to me either. I don't see what the government did in order to become part owner of your house. But even then, no, that still doesn't work, because if you were to if the government was to increase the tax rate to 100%, then, I mean, it could. Like, at what level of taxation does it stop? Does it stop being theft? Right? Or does it start being theft? So at 100% of taxation, if it isn't at 20% of taxation, it shouldn't be at 100. It also shouldn't be at 101. So if the government can charge you any amount for the use of its property, then it owns the whole house, right? If you just have to leave, right? Or if you have to leave your house unless you pay taxes, then the government owns the whole house. Like, you can't do that. You can't do that the other way around, right? You can't tell the government to stop interacting with your property unless it pays you taxes, right? You can't set those stipulations. It's only the government that can. So if it's only the government that can set those stipulations, then the government must own your entire house. Yeah, so at this point, in order to say that taxation isn't theft, the government owns roads that they've never been to, wilderness that they never went to, your house, and that's actually not even quite the end of it, because the government will also charge you taxes if you leave the goddamned country. There are some taxes that you have to pay in some situations, just for when you're a citizen of a country. And there are also fees that you need to pay to renounce that citizenship, which is in effect another tax. If it can charge you, no matter where you are, no matter what you do, the government owns you, right? If that's the case, if the government really is able to, without it being theft, take as much as it wants from you, then the government must own everything. So that's how that kind of worked in my head at the time. It seems to me just ridiculous that you could say that the government owned everything, and any framework of ownership in which the government doesn't own everything would mean that taxation just kind of has to be theft, and at most could be justified theft. Now, I no longer think it's even justified theft, right? After learning a bit more economics, going through a bunch more arguments, losing arguments to libertarians, I, at some point, eventually realized, okay, no, it's not even justified theft. It's insane theft. It's theft that actually makes stuff even worse than regular theft because of the stuff the government does with that money. But yeah, all right, so that's all for today. Look at patrons. These are all awesome people. You should be one. And hopefully we'll have some more content coming out fairly soon. I plan to record this alongside a couple of other videos. So maybe I'll do regular content.